Hey, everybody. This is Jan Todd, and this is the first lecture for Module 1 as we go through our 6 weeks of Sociology of Religion. I'm looking forward to sharing a few things from the text and also walking you through some major concepts to be able to use them as you integrate that with the videos that you're watching, the documentaries, and also the threads. So let's get started. I often tell people I'm a huge theory person, but I try to make it exciting. And with sociology of religion, there's just a lot that when we apply theory to the way in which we look at religion, we have to give ourselves that sense of that lens that we're not trying to figure out if this is true or not. We're just trying to observe and use the sociological imagination. So let's talk a little bit about that. First, you do not have to be religious to understand religion from a sociological perspective. It's just like any other group. We're studying how this set of beliefs affect how people socialize, how they organize, how they take in beliefs and values and norms based on their beliefs about whether they believe in God or not, whether they have a philosophy. And it's really important for us to recognize that we're going to use the terms gods or God in a non-value judgment way, because each one of these groups is important for us to see where they come from their perspective. So that's the first thing I want to make sure we start off with. To remind you that sociology is a scientific study of society is the purview for how we're going to look at the whole 6 weeks. This is a science. We're trying to understand the intersection of how people and groups interact based on those beliefs and practices that they've put out there or they've learned in major ancient histories of some of these religions that have been adapted over time. And so we're going to study that. A lot of times you're going to be asked to consider looking at the weekly religion that we're focusing on and to kind of bring out what you see from observations, for example, about how they treat gender, or if they're patriarchal or matriarchal, if they have a sense of being highly involved in society, or if they retract from society. So these are the ways in which we're going to look at religion throughout. The point of this course is to connect sociology, religion, social issues, and the ideas about the meaning of life by studying these groups and what they practice, or if they don't practice an actual religion. It's important to recognize that we call religion something that is an institution. And so certain groups, if you are religious yourself, you may not acknowledge certain groups as religious. But as sociologists, we are going to see if there is some sense of spirituality, or if there's some sense of even philosophy that guides these groups based on their beliefs and their practices, then we will qualify that as religion. So I have 2 questions to get us started. How does religion influence and interact with society? How do we see that happening? And I want you to think beyond just, the United States. How does it affect the world and the different societies within the world? And then I also want you to bring it back and say, how does it affect your particular community? Do you notice a particular type of religion that is finding more influence, and why is that? And then finally, on the second question, how does society influence and interact with religion? Meaning, there are times that religion is obviously used to get certain beliefs and certain power and give that power to certain groups. And that often comes from the societal end. And so we'll talk more about that over this course. Our place to always start, it seems like, when we're teaching about any of the different types of sociological study, is to start with C. Wright Mills and his sociological imagination. This is what I want you to have for this whole course. The ability to imagine a group or society through their norms and their values and their structures in order to understand rather than to judge them. Now, does that mean that you're going to have some difficulty with some of these belief systems? Absolutely. You'll have that with anything that you study in sociology. When we study racism, when we study sexism, when we study how bureaucracy works, you're always going to have a bias. So I want you to be aware of that. But to be completely effective for the 6 weeks, I want you to really use the sociological imagination. Think about it from the group's point of view or individual's point of view. And for Mills, that intended to unite science and social justice in a way when we did this that helps us to recognize the voice and the story and the narrative of each of these groups. And once again, not to judge them as right or wrong. Additionally, we will be framing the whole course by studying religion through the lens of race and ethnicity and sex and gender. So when we're doing our threading throughout the week, which means to do your post, have people respond to your post or be a responder to people's posts, often keep that lens of how does this focus religion, or how do we see this particular group. For example, we're looking at Judaism this week. How do they view race and ethnicity? How would they define race? Because there's a lot of times Jewish people are called a race, but when you think of American terms for race, that's not based on skin color. So think about that a little bit. Sex and gender. How is the importance of being segregated by sex? Something that you see in Judaism. What types of Judaism do that? There's a Hasidic video that I want you to watch, the Hasidic practices, and pay strong attention to how gendering is done, and think about those things. So we're going to do that, and that will be a lot of fun. So how do we study religion and sociology, or study it sociologically? Sorry about that typo. I'm just going to let that go. First, we study it critically, not judgmentally. I've said it already, but I'm going to keep saying that throughout. You may be bothered by certain things, but I want you to come back into it and say, how am I looking at this critically? How am I thinking through it analytically? Why does this make sense to this group of people? We're not determining the rightness or the wrongness of a religion or a spiritual group. We're not arguing God or God's existence, but rather studying the group and who they are and how they organize and the meaning of life. That's the most important question. It's what defines religion typically is how is it describing the meaning of life, what we do with our life. The ultimate goal then is to understand, not judge, what are the essential qualities of each religion or philosophy, and be able to look at them with the terms of theory, the terms that we learn through superstition and spirituality and all the different stories and narratives that go along with that. So let's get to the definition. What is religion? Well, based on our text, this actually comes from a quote in the text, but it's more or less a fixed institution. So you need to know that it is an institution that exists independent from the people who attend its services, volunteer for its programs, and serve in its administrative offices. Basically, it's this. When you look at a religion, you can't necessarily say that one person has control over it. Now, in the Catholic Church, a lot of people might say, hey, the Pope has high authority. Well, that is true. But the Pope also has a whole entire set of different dioceses and lots of different consults that help with that. He obviously works with nation states as well and lots of political institutions. So he's not independent, nor is the whole people independent. The other thing that you need to recognize is somebody can call themselves Catholic, but then you have to say what type of Catholic. Are they Benedictine? Are they Franciscan? Are they part of the more traditional conservative, or are they part of a more progressive? These are all terms that we put to the groups. And so that's why we're saying it exists outside of itself, because there's lots of different ways in which people claim that title, but they may not necessarily think or feel the same way, have the same beliefs, or vote the same, or practice the same. So that's what that means. It's also an institution that teaches particular beliefs and practices and expects new and continuing members to conform to those practices. And this is Heels and Woodhead, who offered the earlier piece as well. That means that the continuance is found in the doctrine. And so that will be something that adapts over time. We're going to talk about that in a future lecture. And yet there's a continued sense of tradition, and that tradition takes time to change. So often you will see religions not necessarily being on the forefront of change, and often changing with society over time, or on occasion you'll see religion changing society. And we'll talk about that with the Protestant ethic in a little bit. It's just important for us to recognize how those reflections happen both on each other in society and also within the religion itself. So what's the difference between religion and spirituality? I don't know if you have a lot of friends that say this: I am not religious, but I am spiritual. Well, that's true. That's really what we see in the United States. A large exodus of people practicing religion in the institutions and the locales and the spaces that have traditionally been the places that people have practiced. And they find themselves often having spiritual experience. They haven't given up an idea of a higher power or a higher philosophy or a sense of a moral standard. So that's a big difference you have to recognize. Are you religious? Or are you spiritual? Are you both? And this is something that Lexcow helps us to really look at. Let's look at it this way. First, religion is more communal, whereas spirituality is more individual. Think about it for just a second. How is that true? When you look at a religion, what are the expectations? Is it something that people do individually, or are you expected to be part of a group? Is it something that you continue to support with your funds and your time? Think about spirituality. Is that requiring a group? Can you be spiritual? Can you do yoga or meditate? Can you have a philosophy or read to improve yourself? So these are the distinctions, that religion tends to be more communal and spirituality tends to be more individual. The four things that we see in the book that help us understand religion in this way is: one, it's a fixed emphasis on groups or the bigger group, trying to identify yourself with that label. For example, I'm a pastor in the United Methodist Church. That's a particular office that I hold. I'm an ordained elder, but that emphasis of that isn't individual. I am part of a group that I had to go through seminary. I had to go through all kinds of board interviews and be part of what's called an order of elders. It sounds very much like Harry Potter, Order of the Phoenix, and I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of similarities. The same would be true with priesthoods. The same would be true with becoming a rabbi. These types of groups have fixed emphasis on leaders of groups, training up your leaders, and then the group's adherence. Religion teaches doctrine, which is basically beliefs and practices. That doctrine doesn't change quickly. The doctrine, for example, in Islam is that God is one. And when you say that and you don't believe that there's any other person sharing that position, including Muhammad or Jesus or Buddha, that doctrine is their number one doctrine. All other things get determined by that one statement. The same is true for Wicca. Wicca has a doctrine, believe it or not, about the earth and how you treat it. To be Wiccan is to be a person that recognizes a feminine sense of the earth, a Gaia, and Gaia is a term for a god, but not necessarily a term for a god. It's more spiritual, but it's a doctrine that people learn. So that's something to pay attention to. Is it a religion? Is there a doctrine being taught, or is it spirituality? Is it more individual? Religion focuses on congregations having certain obligations to the larger whole. Even if you're part of for example, the Southern Baptists is part of a group of individual churches that come together for the Southern Baptist convention, but each individual church has its own sense of autonomy on certain things. They still have a discipline and they still have certain things that they hold in common, but those congregations are expected to report back to each other. This is true for dioceses. This is true for, you have different temples, and in Judaism, for example, you may have Orthodox Jews, and they're part of a larger system of Orthodox Jewish connection. And those congregations connect with each other. So there's a sense of that. And finally, there's practice ritual that has been passed down generation after generation, whether it be a sense of being able to be on the path to nirvana, and how you do that's through meditation, or whether it be that you practice a baptism or a Brit, which is the circumcision, or if you participate in Islam to be able to go do a Hajj and go to the Holy Land, which is their Mecca, and to go around the Kaaba. These are things that we pass on and are expected in each one of these religions. Now, spirituality we see happening on large droves and big scales in the United States. And it's not coincidence. As we are a nation that really worships individuality, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, even though we expect a sense of patriotism and connection, there is a high level of spirituality that is expected. Again, I spelled that wrong. I'll change that on the individual slides. But it emphasizes the personal feelings. So this is not so much about the group. This is about you. If you're a spiritual person, it's your connection with the philosophy or the God or gods that you're believing in. And so you see a lot of people say that, they read a lot. They may have certain practices that look ritualistic, and yet they're not getting that from a large group, nor are they adhering to a larger group typically. It emphasizes the individual in such a way that the person is responsible, and it's not even about their own salvation. Usually it's a sense of their own purpose of finding peace or meaning, once again, in life. It tends to be holistic, meaning it's often meant to heal your body. It has a sense of you knowing yourself a little bit more and being more contemplative. And a lot of times the practices that you do with spirituality is a response to something you need in your life, trying to fill a hole. And finally, you're free to construct it yourself, meaning nobody's going to go and check your spirituality and say, I don't know if that is a true belief. And we typically say if a person's spiritual, they may borrow some from Catholicism, they may borrow some from Buddhism, they may borrow some from Baha'i or philosophy. They may be a person who likes to read Nietzsche and at the same time really look into science in a way that seems to answer everything for them. So that's how spirituality works. But a similarity both share, and this is probably the core, and we'll look at this, is how they rely on faith. Faith is that which cannot be proven or disproven, but accepted as true. So a person who is part of a religious group, why are they accepting and having faith in this doctrine and in this way of seeing the meaning of life? Same is true with spiritual people. Why do they adhere to these spiritual practices? Why is it accepted as true? Does it help? Is numerology something that people absolutely, think if they're being spiritual works for them? And why do they think that's true? And that's a good question for us to always ask. What is the answer that they would give? And just learn from that and see how that shapes the society and the place that they're in. Peter Berger is one of our greatest sociological religious thinkers. He wrote The Sacred Canopy. I highly recommend it. I didn't put it into this course. It's pretty dense. It's graduate material. But if you ever are interested in kind of seeing how secularism and religion play a part in life, Peter Berger's The Sacred Canopy would be really good for you to read. He asks 4 questions, though, that he thinks are the existential imperatives, the things that we as humans always ask. And this, therefore, leads us to either religion or spirituality or a philosophy. The questions are, who am I? Why am I here? How should I live? And what happens when I die? Now, the first 3 are ones that, I think a lot of us are surrounded by people that ask those questions, and people will tell you in your early socialized life. If you grew up in a religious community, they might tell you who you are based on those doctrines and beliefs about humanity. They may have a sense of purpose that they've instilled into your life, and they may give you certain morals and guidelines. What happens when I die, however, is a really big question that I often say is the biggest existential, because whether you're spiritual, religious, or not, we are all curious about this. Now, a lot of people do not, believe in the afterlife. So that's the first thing you have to recognize, is that is particular to certain religions, that there's a belief in an afterlife. Certain people are not religious and they believe there is an afterlife. So we have to take our stereotypes of a non-religious or a religious person, or a non-spiritual or a spiritual person, and not necessarily, say, well, obviously people who don't have religion think about what happens when they die. Well, that's not true. In fact, Steve Jobs, who is known to be an agnostic, is often said to have studied that a lot. What happens when you die? And he was facing cancer. So this is when a crisis happens in our life. We sometimes ask those questions. And so this is the thing. The first three are often socialized in our life a little bit. And the last one is something that I feel humanity questions as well. And it doesn't have to have a religious meaning. Religion's belief is also collective. This is a thing that we have to recognize. Nobody just comes up with an idea. Sure, we have an idea, but to become a value, an idea has to have more people buy into it, buy into the leadership, buy into creating doctrine or scripture. And so we always have to recognize all of our religion over time is collective, and it's a collective totality of social beliefs. Now try to think about a religion that doesn't try to tell you how to live in society. That's something that is often something we don't think about, but really it's trying to tell us how we live together, or maybe live together as we believe. And believing different things is sometimes very difficult when we have people that believe you have to all believe the same way. So you have to recognize the collective. And when we're looking at these different religions throughout the next 6 weeks and the different groups, for example, when we look at Scientology or when we look at cults, what is it that is the collective totality? Because one person isn't going to have the same influence unless there's a whole group creating those beliefs together and believing in those beliefs together. And that comes to a Greek word called nomos. Nomos is that belief system, and it explains the meaning of life. So when you think of David Koresh, for example, in Waco, Texas, there's a whole entire history of that group being around for a really long time before the actual, and there's some documentaries on this too. It was really hard for me because I wanted to have you watch so many documentaries, but I had to kind of just keep that short. But nomos is that belief system. It gave meaning to life for the people that were in that compound. And we have to think about that even with some of the local compounds that we know of. Why do people stay with Fred Phelps and the Hillside, or the Baptist church? And I just blanked on it right now. But that sense of that group has a belief system and explains the meaning of life to many people. And so we have to recognize that is important, whether or not it is something you agree with. Without nomos, meaning in life, we fall into what's called anomie, life without value of norms. And typically what we see with anomie, when it's normlessness, there's no norms, we see the increase in suicide. You see people that tend to see life changing. Now, right now we're seeing increases in suicide. It's not surprising me because in history, when we have major economic change, when we have systemic change, for example, moving into a millennial age from an industrial and a modernity age that has led up to the time of the internet and us using that as a norm in a normative way, that creates a huge juggernaut in all the different ways in which we find meaning. And so we often see anomie take place. We also see people turn to more religious meaning. They try to find meaning. And so we see a growth in particular kinds of religion. And we often see a growth in certainty. What people want to say is, this is absolutely the truth, because they're afraid to feel without value or norms, that they're afraid to feel what life is like without that. And so that's a question we always have to look at. When we look at theories, we have to look at theorists. And the theorists that we'll look at are our three major ones we look in most of our sociological work with: Emile Durkheim, Karl Marx, and Max Weber. Now, Emile Durkheim is the listed first, but Karl Marx actually lived before Emile Durkheim, and Emile Durkheim and Max Weber were contemporaries, meaning they lived around the same time. All of them lived during the time where the Industrial Revolution had taken hold beyond the 1740s, where we started to really see the world open up as far as world trade, and the capitalist merchant capitalism was the system that was taking hold. And we were starting to see the means of production, meaning how we do and make things, start to industrialize and urbanize. And each one of them had their take on how religion interpreted that. Emile Durkheim says that religion is the collective effervescence of society, meaning it is the place where the spirit takes hold. And we socially construct this way in which we look at life through four major pieces of the four major ways of looking at the world, and where we get our meaning from. And that religion helps us to either embrace or combat these four constructs, these ways we experience the world. The first is egoism, which is just ourselves. Religion can help us understand ourselves, the things that are going inside our minds, the good and the bad that we interpret within. Altruism is how we act towards others. Are we selfless? And religion teaches you a lot of times how to become more altruistic or have a purpose for being in relationship with society and the rest of the world. And gnomic goes back to that sense of anomie, which is meaning to deal with the fact that sometimes we don't have norms or values that are constant. And so religion helps us to navigate and get through with that collective effervescence of a tradition that changes with society, but still maintains a sense of group collectiveness, that it helps us to combat that. And then finally, the fatalistic piece, which is we're all doomed to die. The big question that was at the end of Peter Berger's What Happens When We Die? Religion helps us the most with that, to try to recognize that we believe there's something beyond just the experience we have. So Durkheim would look at all religions based on how they addressed the individual, how you work in society, how you deal with norms and values as they change, and how you fight that feeling of being fatalistic about life, that we all die. Durkheim also observed and labeled two things that are important. When we look at religion, we have to recognize that religion tends to create out of the ordinary life extraordinary things that are sacred. Sacred temples are often dedicated. When you have a church, the community typically blesses that and commissions that building. And when it's not being used anymore as a church or a sanctuary or a temple, there's a decommissioning service because it's no longer a sacred space. We look at our different rituals, such as communion, or looking at water. And in Islam, ablution is a very important part of your sacred care of your body, which is washing yourself before you enter into prayer, especially those 5 times a day. So they have bathrooms that are set up so that they can go do ablution, cleaning their ears, cleaning behind their neck to keep themselves holy. It's just regular bathroom water, but it's holy in that moment. Therefore, opposite things of that, for example, the stuff you use in your house, everyday, tables, if you eat a piece of bread while you're making a peanut butter sandwich, it's ordinary. So Durkheim says, where is it that we create that sacredness, maybe with the same object, a piece of bread, a cup of wine, a type of robe, a way in which we hold our hands, a way in which we offer ourselves in a sacred way that's extraordinary, outside of the ordinary. And then also, what do we consider profane? We often think profane is like something bad, but basically Durkheim's saying, no, that's not what it means. In this way, it's just meaning, not something sacred. It's just part of our ordinary life. So we're looking at the lens of religion through the Durkheimian models of theory. We have to recognize, okay, what's sacred? What's happening in this religion that's sacred? And what's everyday ordinary stuff that doesn't seem to be something that people have a problem with? Marx, on the other hand, is our wonderful revolutionary, and he looks at religion as a social construct that perpetuates an inequality and class struggle. He believes that it's necessary for us to recognize that most religions do not treat people equally, that there are certain offices and expectations. And even though the message may be that of equality of all types, when you look at the practices, and that's the most important thing to point out, think about if you're part of a religious community, the practice of how people are really treated. I notice as a pastor myself, or even as a teacher, because, sometimes you have some sense of power and enabling you to be in a higher office. There is a sense that's part of these systems, these institutions of religion, these institutions of education, and we have to recognize that. We also have to recognize then there's a class struggle, meaning that a lot of times people with great wealth often will try to use the auspices of religion and religious office to maintain their wealth and to justify their wealth. And also we use it sometimes for people to recognize their plot in life. Religion will often have scriptural references to you accept the office that you're born into life. Marx has trouble with that. He challenges it. He believes in revolutionary religion. He grew up Jewish, and so he has a lot in his writing that points to a sense of how God is not really represented in the institution of religion. Just society is recognized in the institution of religion, and that we call it God and we justify it. So he challenges that status quo, the sense of the institution, and to change that, change and replacement is something that constantly happens in society, especially when it considers that these religious institutions sometimes can be some of the cause of the inequality and the class struggle. Marx often criticized legitimization of religion from gods or God from a top-down piece. People saying we are destined or manifest destiny types of things to own this land or to conquer, like in the Crusades, or to be people that are blessed with wealth. He challenges that. Instead, he says the desired legitimizing of its practices should come from the ground up. What has the religion done for society? How are people changing what they do and want from their faith based on a kind of what's going on the ground, not what's coming down from God to legitimize what you believe? And there's a special note. Many of you might know this quote, the famous quote that religion is the opium to the masses or the people. You need to recognize he's looking at that through a capitalist lens, that he's not saying that about all religion. He had a particular issue at the time with religious groups because of the amount of wealth and power in England, in Germany, in France, and the places that he was part of that Western European powerhouse that was industrializing the world, taking advantage of the worker, and people often finding different religious systems supporting that. And so he believed that it was the opium to the masses to say that the justification of society taking advantage and creating, different opposing groups and the legitimizing of some people being wealthy and some people having nothing was an opiate that religion would say, well, in this life you may have been poor, but you will be rewarded in the end. Or in this life, you are called to be wealthy because you need to care for people. So that's important for Marx's famous quote. It's not just religion is opium to the masses. It's opium to the masses and add in capitalist society, that it helps to legitimate that. Max Weber was known for how religion changes in society based on the values and ideas that are reflexive both from the religious institution onto society and society onto the religious institution. His most famous work is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And to note that when he was studying this, he was studying the birth of the United States and how religious sects such as SECTS, by the way, like the Puritan ethic of keeping yourself from great sloth and keeping yourself from great trivial idle, living, and basically putting your whole self into labor as a recognition that you don't deserve to necessarily just live it up around the world, but to show it as a sign of your salvation, your belief in God, that was a high motivator of why the United States, with the migrants and the system that was in place, was able to thrive because people felt and tied their labor, and they had this value of work that was a sign from God to work for the cross, work for the church, work for the salvation of people, and also know this Calvinistic spirit of predestination, which we don't hear about as much, but at the time, John Calvin had been a strong theologian at the time, and Calvinism had this idea that certain people were predestined to be saved and others were not, based on some biblical scripture. And there's a lot of theology in that, so I won't go into it too much. But that the founding of this nation, as it also conquered Native American tribes, brought in slaves, created several different paths of migration, went through the situation of settling the areas of Mexico and California, and all that was all tied up into this labor of thinking that this was part of our manifest destiny a little bit, and also that labor was a sign of salvation. Weber believed that the ideal type was an unachievable ideal, that if we worked to the best of our ideals to be perfect in our practices, our values, and beliefs, that was what was going on, and that the ideal type at the time was that labor was a sign of your salvation, or at least the possibility of you being saved, and that work was more than livelihood, but it was also for you to be able to avoid temptation. So the ideal type of a person, even though we know that not everybody or very few people actually met this ideal type, was the hard-working individual laborer who did not do anything but work for God, didn't spend too much, had enough to get by, and saved their money. And that lasted for about 60 years in the early founding of the country, and then continued to change as people gained more wealth. They also had society change those ideals. Also, Max Weber would say that, and this Talcott Parsons was the one who said that the iron cage is how we should title it. But Max Weber called the steel hard casing a part of our life where we are caught in the societal thrums of life, just how we do things as if they're normal and as if they were set up by God, or if they were set up by our higher power. And that casing is something we can't see. We can't see the bars. We're actually looking through them a lot of the time. We accept the norms that we're supposed to labor, that we're supposed to have class systems, that we're supposed to have authority in religious systems. And so when Weber would look at religion, he would often say, how does religion contribute to that iron cage and the maintenance of that ideal type, that way in which people looked at society in that way and said, this is what we're supposed to do. This is what gives meaning to life. But as things are often challenged in an institution, there are people that are charismatic. The word charisma means another person's belief about another person's power, meaning charisma isn't something somebody can just have on their own. We say there are people that are charismatic, but they're charismatic because people are drawn to and believe that this person has special power. Now, all of our major religions have obviously founders of charisma. Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Moses. They may not be what we look at as charisma today. We often stick that to people that can speak well. We have stories that Moses stuttered, or that people who have a sense of being able to make things happen. But it's interesting when you look at religion, the charisma is really the sense of humbleness is typical in our 5 major religions, that there is an expectation for that person to be more holy and not look like the rest of society, which is trying to, work with the world of wealth or status. But that it's actually the charisma of that person being somehow blessed by a higher power. And that humbleness is part of that charisma. So when we look at Marx and Durkheim and Weber, we have to recognize that they're looking at the institution, but they also recognize people of charisma come along, they adapt those religious institutions, whether it be through revolution, whether it be through challenge of current doctrine, and often that's a result of what's going on in society. What they've seen as the practices of the religion have either upheld inequalities and power, or have not challenged it enough, and people get drawn into that sense of change. Okay, we're going to go through a couple things here about how early Christianity was set up, and one reason Christianity is brought to the table. And everyone listening to this, may be like, well, this is all about all religion. Well, currently, this is coming from a world systems approach, that the current system that we have on a worldwide trade scale right now is capitalism. And as I mentioned earlier, Weber was saying how the Protestant work ethic, which, by the way, the Catholic work ethic was in there too, but you have to read the whole work, but the Protestant work ethic of denying yourself and laboring and creating a place where capitalism could thrive, and then seeing how Western Europe and colonialism was shaped, that the current models of all of our systems are either in the process of being capitalist or being in response to capitalism. And since that has such a high Christian context, that's why when we look at the history of our current societies, we often turn to that intersection of where Christianity took on that sense of the capitalist spirit as well. And so we have to look at what happened in early Christianity that's way back, like talking right after Jesus died, and the groups that were starting to form there was that friendship networks started to develop. And that was unheard of. You didn't have friendship networks in Judaism. You might have had some in Rome, but they were based on caste. But these were friendship networks that challenged the iron cage of the time and followed a charismatic leader that basically said that people were all able to be part of this salvific life together, and that wealth was not the sign of that. And so we have to look at all major religions kind of in that light too. When we look back, is how did their early start reflect what was going on in society or challenge the iron cage of what was going on at the time. For Muhammad, it was, there were large groups that the nomads often would come and raid and rape the villagers, and just a reflection of how that was unjust. And the cabal was full of all these gods that they saw as profane. And then when we see Buddha, we see him rejecting his wealth as a prince in his story, and taking on the plight of releasing himself from this life, but also recognizing poverty as a way of life. And so and then also coming back, we see the major big belly Buddhas as well. So what the point of this is go back to the earliest point, and I often bring up Christianity, and so does the text, where the network of the group that was started by the charismatic leader was challenging society at the time. And how did that then create groups? And then how did those groups gain power? And we'll learn about that in the next lecture as well. Sometimes a group can get so large and so powerful. For example, we saw the Catholic Church after Constantine basically gave authority to this church to be married to the state in Rome. And also we saw the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople also start to gain some power, that more authority was given to religious institutions. Now, the interesting thing is that society is a reflection of becoming part of the group, belonging, finding their norms and their values in these religious contexts or in these philosophies. Often will give itself over to authoritarianism because there's a sense of not wanting to deal with the bigger questions. And what I mean by that is it may start off as a humble, non-bureaucratic movement. And we see this happen time and time again in religion, where it's not meant to be something that is going to take nation states or countries by storm. But as it's blended into the societal organization of life, and authority is started to be shared both between either a state and religion or the religious authority. For example, the King of England or the Queen of England is considered the head of Church of England. There's this sense that society in the end, when a religion grows to a certain point, is desiring some form of authoritarianism so that we don't have to deal with the larger questions in life and we can just turn toward that authority. And so when we see great times of turmoil and when we see a lot of unrest, usually it's that authority that's being challenged. You know, those answers that were desired from that leader or those groups of leaders no longer suffice. And so we start to see a waning from that, a challenge to the authority. But in time, what we typically see is a reorganization, and then new authority is deemed by society to the group that they think is reflexive of the cage they want to be in, the one that they see as something that can keep life sustainable. So this is important for us to recognize, is when people and groups have that sense of authority and we start to see religion grow, whether it be the Western religion of Christianity, whether we see, Taoism, or we see Confucianism in China grow, that there's also particular types of people that are often seen as the leaders. And one thing we have to recognize in our Americanism is that when we say race and ethnicity, it looks very different because we often attach the physical race that is, white, black, whatever box you want to check on some sort of a survey to that. And ethnicity is a cultural, which is our typical definitions. That may not be a worldwide piece. For example, like I said, the Jewish race isn't something that's based on a sense of physicality. It's based on a sense of practice and belief and being part of that group. And ethnicity is something that is seen as something that is part of who the culture is. And so we can have, in some ways, a Western ethnicity based on our religion, because we tend to either, follow those capitalist principles a little bit. So that's something we have to recognize first, is that when we're looking at sociology of religion, it's a little different than looking at societies themselves, because there are some ways in which the religions themselves define that. The other thing is that we see also a great divide sometimes based on race. In the United States, for example, we call Sunday morning the most segregated hour in the week, because we tend to see people who do religious service, and our most attended religious service in the United States is some form of Christianity, but they tend to not be multicultural or have, a varied crowd, but mostly a similar looking crowd. And so that's something to keep in mind too, is that religion may have different meanings based on race and ethnicity and the type of religion. For example, Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic churches tend to have mostly Hispanic or Central American or South American attenders, whereas we see Benedictine or Franciscan congregations, and they tend to look a little bit more European. So that's important to keep in mind where we're looking at each one of these religions. The other thing is religion tends to also create the great other, because we believe these things so highly, and we've often been socialized in the United States, for example, socialized with Christian, Protestant ethics, even if we're Catholic, or that sense of labor, that people that think other than that, we often create a great other outside of that. A person that is opposite of what we believe then is something alien to us. And that happens time and time again. You've heard it so many times, oh, those religious groups, they've just been fighting for years. But when you really get down to it, is it just because of their religious beliefs, or are there societal issues going on? Are there ways of doing government? Is there some form of oppression that had happened from one over the other? What's the history? Is there an issue of gender going on that people are trying to change, women's rights? Is there a way in which people are looking at sexuality differently? So those great others aren't necessarily based on just because a person believes that way. A lot of times it's created with the intersection of all those things, but the label of the religion is what's used. The other great divider, again, as we lift it up, is women and men. When we look at religions, we have to be very careful about how we look at how the roles of females and males, or if we have, religious groups that are more inclusive of all the gender spectrum and the sex spectrum, how they see those roles. For example, you may struggle with a more conservative view of a woman with a hijab if you're not Islamic. We may see that as oppression. When we're looking at this through this lens of sociology of religion, that's not how we want you to judge that. We want to see why. You want to see why that religion has that. What do the women say about that? Yes, on a social justice scale, there are oppressions going on just as much as there are in Christianity and Judaism and Scientology and atheism, but to recognize that you're going to bring your own bias and don't create a great divider there when you're looking at these religions. Really try to understand why those roles are there and or are not there. That's an important good question. We also have to recognize that religion is based on location, and it can look very different. If you are, for example, a person who is Islamic, and you are in Saudi Arabia has a much different governmental connection with their Sunni and Shiite is very different than, for example, going to the Sudan or going to even Jordan. You have to recognize the location of what's going on in the government to understand what's going on with the religion. Same is true for Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism. They all have a locality to them. So be very careful, especially when you're picking your final project or a group that you're going to look at, that you recognize the location that they're coming out of, because it can be very different to be Buddhist in California and be Buddhist in some parts of Burma, or well, actually, that's not even a country anymore, but to be involved in places is important to recognize what's going on there. The other thing is to notice the difference between rural society and urban society. Rural society religion is often very close-knit, has close ties, and typically most of the groups within those small rural communities know who the Baptists are, know who the people who don't go to church are, and there's a strong communal tie. urban religion doesn't. It has more individualistic, and this both are called Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft by Tones, who was a sociologist that studied how even religion itself was defined very differently, even if it was, all Catholics, but they're different when they're in rural society versus urban society. But a common experience that we're seeing happen in both rural and urban society is the consumerist society. That less and less people are necessarily sticking to the religion that they were raised in. And because, and especially in the United States, but other parts of the world as well, people may choose to shop around for some form of religion that fits their needs. And we also don't see them practicing religion as if it gives them a sense of entitlement in the community, which is often how early religion in the United States was used, to give people a sense of connection and therefore help them with their status in society. We're seeing a lot less of that and a lot more consumerist, where people are like, well, I don't agree with that doctrine, so I'm going to go check out this other church. And so that's happening both in rural and urban society, and is going to be interesting for us to see as it develops. Finally, the last thing I'm going to say, and thanks for hanging in on this, is the study of religion has a difference in how we look at the world based on crowds and communities. One's not better than the other. It's just different. And what I mean by that is large, for example, churches oftentimes could be just as big as a crowd at a baseball game, especially with mega churches, what we're starting to see there. But there's a sense of community that people are always going to want. And so what we have to recognize is that in crowds, people tend to still want to find a community, whether it be a class or a mission group or something that people know their name. But there's also some points that in our modern individualistic society that we don't want to be so tied to community that we can't experience the larger experience of what's going on in the larger world. For example, I go back to Islam on this. On the yearly Hajj, it is amazing when you see that. And there's a video that I'm going to show that shows that people just circling and going in and out around the Kaaba. And not everybody knows everybody. There's often lots of communities that came, but they come to get lost in the crowd and the larger experience, because that tends to enhance their belief that if this many people believe in this, then I must be part of something that's right. And so you are reflecting, when you look at a religion, how are the strong ties of a community, even in spirituality, a person being tied to the community, if they're stealing from Buddhism a little bit, or taking yoga in here, or taking a little bit of Christian iconism, how do those strong ties with maybe the leaders of those, the great writings of that, bring them into that small community? But then also, how do they need those weak ties of a larger group to help them see that this isn't just something they're making up? They're part of something that's larger, and that's something that we'll see in the study of religion, that people tend to go back and forth between those. And why? Well, there's lots of different reasons, but one I would say is for us to have norms and values that give us meaning, which is what we look at. So as we study religion and spirituality throughout the sociological imagination that we're going to be using, please ask good questions. Don't be afraid to look. Don't judge, and try to understand, as religion helps us to understand how society reflects how religion gives us meaning, how philosophy gives us meaning, even how being an agnostic or an atheist or humanism can give a person meaning, and therefore help us to shape how we do the practices of being human and alive. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll keep talking through our threads this week. If you have any questions, please text. My phone number is here, always at the end of the slides. And also, there's a little spot for you to give me a email if you want to contact me that way.